Good afternoon, as the case may be. My name is Eric Daly, and welcome to the Multnomah Group's webinar presentation today on why your retirement plan doesn't work. Despite the fact that every good presentation training course says try and stick to 3 or 4 things, I'm going to try and illuminate maybe 13 traps that help reduce the effectiveness of your retirement plan prospectively. To that end, I'm really going to work on an agenda that covers just the explanation of behavioral biases and how those impact retirement plans maybe more acutely than almost anywhere else that we anticipate them in our daily jobs and lives. And some of the factors that impact arguably the 4 areas wherein participant retirement readiness and success are most touched. The level of their employee contributions, the investment returns they achieve, their ability to immunize themselves against longevity risk by utilizing lifetime income type solutions, and the length of the contribution retirement period, which ultimately is impacted by the first 3. The reality is that we are experiencing significant delays in retirement time horizons, and largely a result of the fact that participants are yet in a position where they can safely retire. I'm the managing principal of the Multnomah Group. I work heavily with our tax-exempt practice and also increasingly on the topic of retirement income and retirement readiness, consistent with a white paper we published a couple of months ago about how plan sponsors are better managing their defined contribution engagements, and this is really a continuation on that theme. Behavioral biases is really the study of how human beings make decisions. It's an economics field and really studies social, cognitive, and emotional factors that impact the economic decisions that we make day to day. I think there's a couple of great quotes, and Sir Isaac Newton probably being the best, which I can calculate the motion of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. He said that in response to the 1720 South Sea bubble, where the stock of the South Sea Corporation that had exclusive trading rights with South America grew in a one period from 100 to 1,000 pounds per year before collapsing. One of the cute little practices that South Sea employs is actually loaning money to investors to buy shares of stocks. You can imagine the massive number of bankruptcies that came as a result of that. But it's important as it relates to retirement plans, especially on the investment side, to look at how participants deal with, in many cases, financial loss. Financial losses are processed in the same area of the brain that responses to mortal danger, and as a result, it's very difficult to get participants to understand, appreciate, and in some degree accept the risk-reward relationship that comes with investing in equities or even fixed income instruments for that matter. Primary issues that we have in the retirement benefits field that ultimately we haven't decided what the purpose of retirement plans are. Defined contributions initially were a supplemental leg to Social Security, and in some cases defined benefit pension arrangements and personal savings. They clearly have moderated and migrated into being the primary retirement investment vehicle. And I think that ultimately in that role, we have done a poor job in trying to decide what the purpose is. Is the purpose allow participants the opportunity to defer taxation by participating? Is it an opportunity for sophisticated investors to get access to investment products? Is it an avenue for participants to accumulate wealth over time? All of those can be valid objectives for a retirement plan. I would argue primary purpose is to develop an opportunity for employees to develop adequate retirement income replacement. And do that effectively, separate from the accumulation of wealth and tax deferral pieces. There's 3 to 4 primary factors that go into, is your plan, given those objectives, successful? The first, level of contributions, employer and employee. How much is being put into these accounts on an annual basis? When do you start? When do you stop? Clearly, investment returns are important in an area where participants are breaking down and accumulating suboptimal returns. Of lifetime income has been perhaps an under-discussed. If you look at defined benefit plans and defined contribution plans, one of the huge changes is that in a defined benefit plan, the average participant lives to 78. The employees, the participants, at 68, the money that's been set aside for their retirement can be used to pay out those that live into their 90s and even past 100. In the defined contribution model, there is no longevity protection. We have to plan and expect that we're going to live well into our 90s, despite the fact that most will not. The fact that we don't collectivize in some form or fashion, the protection of longevity on the back end is certainly helping participants achieve retirement security. The end result of that really is the length of the contribution retirement period. Because on the length of contribution, the earlier you start, the easier it is, but the reality is that most of the impact is really on the latter side. So participants start later, work longer, their retirement periods are shorter, and that ultimately is how they balance out their retirement income inequality. And presentation with maybe the first of the 13 biases, and that's the confirmation bias. So agree with what I say, you're going to like today's presentation. People do hear opinions that they agree with. Unfortunately, if you don't agree with this opinion, it's going to be difficult for me to change your mind. But I'm going to try and present some evidence that hopefully will support my contentions in some of the areas where defined contributions really struggle to deal with behavioral biases. Let's start with the level of contributions. I mentioned the 4 factors that can contribute to retirement plan health. The level of contributions is a critical one. So in a defined contribution plan, excluding any Social Security, this is a really good study conducted by Dimensional Fund Advisors and then Marlena Lee from Dimensional who did the study that looked at, well, what level of contribution would be necessary to achieve a 50% probability of having 75% of your income replaced in retirement at age 65 versus a 90% probability versus a 95% probability. Surprisingly, what you see is the higher your income, the larger percentage you need to save, and the primary reason being that less of your income will be replaced by Social Security. But the numbers are startling. So for those employees that earn more than $100,000 a year, you're looking to get 90% probability at contribution rates of 15% to as much as 20 to 21% to achieve that level of security. And it is that the savings rates and contribution rates by employees and by employers is woefully short of that 15 to 21% contribution rate. So what are the reasons? Well, certainly one of the huge ones is the status quo bias, which is that we as human beings dislike change. We ultimately don't like to make choices if we can avoid it or procrastinate, and certainly one of the choices that we ask many participants to make is when how much to contribute to their retirement plan in a defined contribution setting. You can see data related to participation rates for plans that utilize automatic enrollment or opt-out enrollment versus opt-in enrollment, non-auto enrollment plans. A tremendous difference, much of which is a byproduct of I don't have to do anything. So the status quo changes from not participating to participating in retirement plans. And it's a tremendous impact. It hurts investors who defer and begin saving for retirement at a later date. So the solution that many have come to is, well, we should all have automatic enrollment. And I think there's some data that would indicate that that certainly does help support participation rates. But status quo bias has a secondary feature to it, which is that when you utilize an automatic enrollment feature and contribution, you actually have participants deferring to the plan lower rate than plans that don't have automatic enrollment. So you can look at it for all employees, young employees, so those under the age of 25, lower income employees, even those earning less than $30,000, where you would expect younger population and your low income populations that automatic enrollment may be the only way to get people to save. But the reality is that there's a 1.5 to nearly 2% difference saving rates for those two critical groups within your retirement plan population. Again, another byproduct of status quo bias, with about 70% of automatic enrollment plans utilize a 3% default as their enrollment opt-in. You end up getting participants who do get into the plan, but they stay at that 3% automatic enrollment rate for the remainder of their participation and employment under the terms of the plan. There's been interesting studies and some discussion led by the Internal Revenue Service and certainly supported by the Department of Labor that says perhaps this whole notion of a 3% opt-in, which is the product as a result of having it be an example in some of the language related to automatic enrollment, maybe percent's not the right number. And EBRI, that does the 2013 Retirement Confidence Survey, actually did a study that said, hey, what if 6% was the automatic enrollment instead of 2%? The reality is it doesn't have a tremendous change in how participants interact with the plan. So when surveyed participants say, well, maybe 2 out of 10 participants opt out if they had a 3% mandatory contribution or opt-in contribution. If you doubled it to 6% of pay, that really only goes to 3 in 10 who say that they would opt out of an automatic enrollment arrangement of that nature. I think that it's very, very likely from a regulatory perspective that we're going to get some additional guidance and some changes ultimately in how participants interact with and what level plan sponsors choose to have participants opt in to automatic enrollment plans at. The same notion that we talk about frequently is investment returns. So we have struggles with getting participants into plans, struggles that can be solved by either increasing the automatic enrollment rate or prospectively adopting an automatic increase program that helps participants from a status quo bias increase to the level of participation that's necessary to help ensure their retirement planning success. The area where we see behavioral finance and economics really have a detrimental impact on participants is on the investment return side. Getting back to the notion that participants are impacted dramatically of the risk of loss, especially when it relates to money, the same they are mortal danger, you really begin to see the impacts of that over long periods of time on participant returns. Our study, which is the annual review of broad market performance versus individual performance. So your typical participant in a defined contribution setting provides startling data, unfortunately, about the lack of success that participants have in investing their own accounts. You get the differences between the S&P 500 index versus the average equity investor of almost 500 basis points a year over a 20-year period. The differences in the fixed income between the bar zag and the average fixed income investor, well over 500 basis points. And the rate that both of those investors, fixed income investors not outpacing inflation that period of time, equity investors just barely outpacing inflation over that period of time. So this level of disparity, while can be explained by a number of factions, sort of focus on fees and making sure that we reduce the impact of fees on participant returns is critical, but in a way is the gap between performance of investors in the broader market exclusively explained by fees. While there's some very expensive, bad investment products out there, I don't think I've ever seen one that comes in at 5+% a year in operating earnings. One issues that we need to look at as it relates not just to participation and allocation is the notion of the bandwagon effect. I think this can be reported on both sides of the equation. They did a study back in 2003 that looked at presidential elections and surveyed people of differing levels of academic progress and saying, well, how do you decide who you're going to vote for? What you saw is that, anywhere from 1 in 20 to 1 in 5 voters saying that agree with the comment that they always vote for the probable winner in an election. We always like to be part of the winning team. So ultimately, participants make decisions that reflect what they believe everyone else around them is doing. So the culture related to generating the belief that retirement savings is an integral part, an important part of our retirement progress, certainly has a significant impact on higher participation rates, higher levels of deferrals into the plan. But the same is true on the investment side, to the extent that there's a culture that says this is a long-term investment phenomenon, that we have trust in the steps that our employer takes to help secure our retirement, are all things that will help not only drive better participation rates, but also will help drive better allocation decisions for participants prospectively. On the return side, the overconfidence that investors have, despite their low level of knowledge about markets, is difficult to argue against. So overconfidence is a behavioral bias, has been studied a number of different places. I think there's a really good study by Fisher and Stottman that reviewed participant surveys about what their prospective returns of the market would be and the prospective returns of what their portfolio would be. Look at it is almost 150 to 200 basis points, so 1.5 to 2% expectation that they would outperform the market, despite the fact that the market has no fees and every investor has fees of some form or fashion. That level of confidence in your own success or ability to somehow outperform an efficient market is troubling, and it leads participants to take more risks in odd places, to try and avoid risk because of their certainty about what's going to happen in the marketplace. And the BAR study, this study, all support the fact that this overconfidence isn't supported by any data. Also has contributed to the fact that people have a hindsight bias, which that they look backward and see things like the 2008 market correction, the market bubble related to real estate, and all things, when you look back at them, seem very, very easy to predict. We all look back at various bubbles, be they the tech bubble, be they the real estate bubble, be they the emerging markets bubble, be they the commodities bubble, and say, well, clearly, when you look at the level of appreciation that had been achieved, the way that you could not have seen this coming. But the reality is, when you look at returns from year to year, the hindsight bias doesn't play out. Unfortunately, it causes participants to avoid volatility where they could achieve returns. It causes them to pursue areas of volatility where there is high levels of risk that may not be consistent with their investment mandate. So the biases, both the overconfidence in their own ability to do better than everyone else, as well as the fact that they can look back and say, well, yeah, I should have seen that. I should have seen that. I will therefore see it the next time it comes around, leads them to make suboptimal decisions. What lacks both 401k and 403b and 457b plans is the familiarity bias. We continue to see, whether it's on the employer stock side, although we've certainly seen a reduction in the amount of employer stock exposure among the defined contribution marketplace, but also this notion that we understand sectors of the economy. I'm a bank, therefore I understand the financial services sector. I am a hospital, therefore I understand the healthcare sector. I'm a tech firm, therefore I understand the technology sector. And I believe that my sector, because of my overconfidence bias, is going to outperform the remainder of the market because I see all the dynamic things that are happening within it. And the reality is that by creating these subsectors that we allow participants to allocate to in sector funds within retirement plans, we're creating high levels of volatility with ultimate random outcomes. So this looks at sector performance over a 13-year period, and ultimately there is no pattern. So despite the fact that we look back and say, oh, well, in 2007, I clearly should have seen that financial services stocks were up 38%, followed by 41%, followed by 20%, 33%. My hindsight bias says, well, clearly I should have expected that financial services stocks were going to go down by 40% the next year when we had the banking crisis. Ultimately, that familiarity leads to enhance the overconfidence bias and hindsight biases that we all have naturally as participants in defined contribution plans. And biggest one, and it gets to this notion of try to protect ourselves from loss is this regret avoidance. And regret avoidance really causes participants to make absolutely horrific decisions about the timing of either getting in or out of the market. Just by sake of example, the most recent market collapse, which goes back to the 2008-2009 banking collapse. You can see returns for the first quarter of 2009 ultimately down broadly. The banking index down nearly 36% for the quarter. You look at the majority of those losses, they were occurred essentially up until 3.9. 3.9 was the low day for most market indices in the 2008-2009 market collapse. March the 10th, following obviously what had been massive bloodshed, 25 to 55% losses across the broad indices, the Dow Jones rose 5.8% on March the 10th. Had you missed March 10th in your effort to try and get out of the bleeding that was the down markets in the prior period, you would have been up roughly 1/3 of the total market return that was achieved from 310 to 331. So if you look at the graph on the far right, ultimately the impact of missing that one day in the market ended up being about a quarter of the total return is. So take the banking sector index. Had you have missed March 10th as a trading date, your 43.8% return would have been chopped down to 32%. And over time, missing on those recoveries and waiting until later in the period has a significant impact on reducing participant return to any broad index. Even for what is perceived to be our highest information investors within defined contribution plans, we have a tendency to focus exclusively on data and news that we pick up from the marketplace. And one behavioral biases that contributes to is this notion of extrapolation. I know that the news associated with this event is going to cause markets to do this, right? The reality is that news as we experience it today may explain the returns that have already been achieved, but no data to support ultimately has any impact on what's going to happen prospectively. Unfortunately, extrapolation, our minds are wired to see patterns in data and patterns in the news that we experience. So we experience what's happened in the markets, the news that supports the continued growth or deterioration, whatever the case may be, of market earnings prices, and we make investment decisions based on that extrapolated model that we have in our mind. But the reality is that prospective changes in market valuation have to do with news events that have not yet become public and are known because they haven't happened. You go back and look at, over the last 70 years, some of the biggest news events and their impact on the markets. Really, all of them have a tremendously detrimental impact when you hear about them. So it ranges from the World Trade Centers are destroyed, markets are down 7% that day, or President Eisenhower has a heart attack, markets are down 6.5% the day it's announced. But they out 1 year, and the changes are the differences in market performance. So the 12-month period was actually after President Reagan was shot by John Hinckley Jr. That was down 17% from that point forward. But conversely, the Cuban Missile Crisis was up 34% from the 12 months ended after the event had been announced. Prospective market volatility is both, I would argue, impossible to predict based on news that's known at the time. There has to be some acceptance at the investor level that ultimately markets walk a regular, random path, and that irregular and random path progresses upward. It is certainly attractive to think that we could avoid losses and pick up gains, but when our attempts to avoid losses end up gains, what we ultimately end up doing is thinking that the total return that we achieve as investors. Again, nothing more graphic demonstration of that than the March 10 period after what has been obviously one of the worst equity market performing periods that most investors in our defined contribution plans have lived through. And the is just neglecting probability, the gambler's fallacy, right? As I mentioned earlier, we're all wired to see events, and we're all wired to see patterns. The reality is that in our effort to try and recognize those patterns, avoid loss, and neglect probability going forward, we try and protect ourselves for things that may or may not occur. I think even since the 2009 recovery, the number of plan sponsors and participants who have predicted the next unwinding of the markets can't get through a retirement committee meeting without talking about risks and concerns about what may happen to the market based on the strong performance that we've really experienced over the course of the last 18 months. But the reality is that trying to avoid that 100-year flood had detrimental impact on participant achievement. So protecting yourself from loss also is protecting yourself against ultimately gain and increasing the likelihood that you have adequate retirement income and longevity protection on the back end. So this neglecting probability / gambler's fallacy, ultimately investors end up buying high because they see patterns and believe in success, sell low because they're trying to protect themselves against loss. The reality is that returns are vastly more dependent on investor behavior than fund performance. Target date side, where we have discussions about glide path allocation, what is the appropriate glide path given our investor population, how much equity exposure, how much international exposure should we have. The reality is that almost without regard to which glide path we pick, as long as we can get participants to remain consistent to a particular approach, whether it be a target date glide path, a 60-40 balanced fund, or any reasonable allocation that might match their time horizon and risk, is going to be vastly more predictive of their performance than did we have the best or the second best or the worst or the second worst large value fund in our core investment marketplace. And every study continues to support the notion that the buy and hold investors in aggregate achieve higher returns than those who try and time the market. The costs of being wrong on market timing are tremendous. It is very painful to be a buy and hold investor, but the data continues to support that generates better returns. The problem is that our overconfidence and our hindsight bias leads us to believe that the buy and hold investors are suckers, that somehow they're being drawn in by the financial services marketplace and therefore not achieving the returns that they should. Reality is that they're outperforming. The probability is that they will continue to outperform those that attempt to time the market. I think it impacts committees and in some degree participants as well. But I think committees so even than on the participant side is the notion of post-purchase rationalization. Everybody's probably experienced this to some degree or another. You make a buying decision and perhaps you're less than happy with the buying decision, but you kind of go through your mind and rationalize all the reasons that you made the right decision, even when the evidence may not support that that's actually the case. Post-purchase rationalization clearly happens on the committee's side as well. Committees go through tremendous amounts of effort and work to select providers, select investment options, but unfortunately also causes plan committees to retain bad investment products or to maintain and continue to utilize ineffective strategies or communication strategies because they want to rationalize the behavior that they've experienced over the course of the last 5 or 10 years of their involvement in the plan, despite the fact that there may be tremendous amounts of evidence that support changing the strategy and approach to meet the new needs of the defined contribution marketplace. So this resistance to adjust investment products and strategies, even when faced with overwhelming evidence, is a part of this post-purchase rationalization. So about the process of not having to reconcile the fact with the that we may have made the best decision we could given the information we had at the time, but now faced with new information, we should make a different decision. That's not to say that committees should run around making investment changes willy-nilly and shouldn't have processes that high levels of turnover. The data also supports that ultimately buy and hold from a committee perspective very, very effectively in comparison to committees that make frequent, repetitive change in investment approach. However, the post-rationalization should allow us as a committee to say, when we bought this investment product, it had this experienced management team. That experienced management team is no longer there. The new team we have no information about. We need to rationalize that discussion. So having committees that are willing to test past assumptions and therefore really make significant changes to how they operate the plan tend to generate better outcomes for their participants. The biggest one is this negativity bias. They all have such a detrimental impact and lead to the Dalbar studies. It's difficult to obviously parse out which is the most painful. But the negativity bias is one that you as plan sponsors, I'm sure, come across with significant regularity. There is no shortage of bad news in the news. Ultimately, the news is in the business of producing and getting people to pay attention to news. I mean, negative bias really goes back to the evolution of the species, which is if you hear that there's a tiger around the corner, that's news you need to pay attention to. If you hear there's not a tiger around the corner, that news is less helpful and useful to you. So positive news and negative news is viewed very, very differently by the mind. But as a result of the negativity bias, we have participants who are protecting, trying to avoid, again, that loss avoidance that we talked about. We see allocations to money market which are inexplicable in the interest rate environment. Money markets are producing 0% returns, inflation in the 2% neighborhood. So really losing 2% of your buying power every year that you continue to allocate to that strategy, despite the fact that there are at least fixed income vehicles that might give you a return that's at least somewhat consistent with inflation. I thought it was interesting. Steve Forbes' comment at the Anderson School, UCLA, back in 2003, you make more money selling advice than following it. It's one of those they count on in the magazine business, along with the short memory of our readers. So, you pick up, whether you pick up Money, Forbes, Fortune, Barron, the Wall Street Journal, you can pick out 5 pieces of negative news every single period. And obviously the correlation with the negative news and the performance of the markets is ultimately 0. And unfortunately, participants are making, even the participants with the best of intention to try and learn about the process and become educated, strong participants and savers, are being hindered by the method by which they go about getting information and making changes to their portfolios. Given all those issues related to the investment mandate, what can you do on the investment side to try and help participants make decisions about their portfolios? There are a few things that are now beginning to be supported by scientific evidence that help participants both A, set a higher rate, and B, make better allocation decisions. And one of those is tiering, categorizing investment menu. It really helps simplify decision-making for new participants. And we'll talk about why that is. But make the decision-making process less about picking the funds out of a list of 30 and more about picking the approach and then making some small allocation decisions based on the approach that you've selected to the marketplace. It doesn't restrict choice for participants, and that's an important aspect of it. So given where defined contributions have come from culturally, it's going to be very, very difficult to eliminate choice and restrict options for participants. But what it does is allow participants to self-recognize the approach that they want to take and therefore have less of a decision-making tree once they elect to get into the plan. There's a really good study recently released, looked at defined contribution plans and the notion of what you could do to increase participation rates and get better investment returns. And it really came up with 4 what I think are critical elements to to help improve defined contribution investment menus and get rid of extraneous and redundant investment options. We understand that having 3 large cap growth investment options have high correlation rates and don't offer significant choice for investors. Ultimately, we rationalize post-purchase having those investment options and don't want to make decisions that may make our participant population unhappy or uncomfortable. The reality is for new employees coming in, it's almost impossible to differentiate between those large growth investment options with regard to how good, bad, or indifferent your education plan may be. So get rid of investment options that don't provide significant differentiation from others in the plan, we think is important. From a patient perspective, really concretize. So really make concrete decisions that participants need to make. So frame the consequences for the decisions that participants make. Ultimately, this goes back to the enrollment phase. So what consequence for not participating? For every 5 years you delay saving for retirement, the first 5 years cost you 1% in additional contributions that you're going to need to make to generate retirement income. If you 10 years, that goes up to 4%. So creating a structure by which participants can better understand how the decision that they're going to make today will impact returns. And that can lead to allocations as well. So the decision that you make to put all your money in the money market because you're concerned about the marketplace means that putting money into the retirement plan will actually not give you more buying power in the future than you have today. And if that's the case, then the only benefit would be the tax deferral that you pick up. This notion of categorization becomes critically important. The human brain can handle categories much more easily than decision trees of choice. So if you say, if you don't know anything about investments, here's what you should do. If you want to achieve market level returns and get a simple allocation, you should do category B. If you want to review the investment options that have been selected by the committee, take a look at category 3. And if you're a sophisticated investor that wants to manage and drive your own allocation account, look at category 4. And we'll talk about those categories here shortly. And the condition for complexity. So what we talk frequently with our clients is inverting a retirement plan. In the 1990s, retirement plans were all about, well, what features and services can we provide employees that are not available in the market as a whole and make our most sophisticated, most engaged participants happy with our retirement plan. I support and profit. Perhaps we should be looking at this a little differently, which is our sophisticated participants are always going to do well. They will take the extra steps necessary to achieve good outcomes. I think the defined contribution marketplace as a whole has failed is on the least sophisticated, least engaged portion of the population. So by converting our retirement plan, if you need nothing that's complex, all you do is auto-enroll in the plan. We'll auto-escalate you to your contribution rate, and we will put you in an allocated product which is low cost and has exposure to the primary asset classes and gets more conservative over time. You're done. There's nothing more for you to do. But if you're a sophisticated investor, perhaps you do have to go an additional 1 or 2 steps to get access to a broader investment universe that may meet your specific needs, goals, objectives, strategy from a retirement planning perspective. One is that we've favored and think provides a lot of opportunity for defined contribution plans is this tiered investment structure that I discussed before. And primary tiering methodologies, although we've done a number with different clients, look some form of asset allocated product for your least sophisticated investors. Certainly target date funds have been discussed. We've done webinars and presentations on them repeatedly. Provide opportunities when well selected to drive better allocation and better returns. We're increasingly incorporating this core index. So in an environment where 404A disclosures and participants are watching frontline pieces, for those participants who just want to have a broad market index at a very, very low cost, providing that in a core index tier for your next most sophisticated tier of investors that doesn't want to look at, did the T. Price fund outperform the Fidelity fund, outperform the Janus fund? In a core environment, they can get market returns that they know should have very, very high correlations to whatever the broad indice is that they're approaching, and do so at a very limited cost to them as participants. For those be even more engaged, having what would be more traditional core set of investment options that you see in most of your 15 to 30 investment option fund menus in that active style box, which is have a slight overweight to growth or value, small or large, REITs, high yield, whatever the instrument may be. You can do that within this core 3 active style. And frequently we're finding that having self-directed brokerage accounts does create a reasonable opportunity when well selected, well monitored, and disclosed to participants for your most sophisticated participants. Rather than trying to appease your most sophisticated, most engaged, and maybe not even sophisticated engaged, maybe just most vocal participants in the core active array, doing so through a brokerage or mutual fund window where you can not necessarily alleviate liability, but certainly bifurcate those and not create investment options that may be actually destructive or hurt the retirement performance of your least sophisticated investors. Really is this utilization of lifetime income. Continually when you survey investors in retirement plans, especially in defined contribution plans, the level of interest in an investment option or some type of vehicle that would guarantee them income for the rest of their life is overwhelmingly high. More than half of participants say they would be very interested in that type of an option. However, when you ask that same population, would they have any interest in an annuity, the reality is that goes down to less than 1 in 5. And I think there are a number of reasons for that, not the least of which being that the annuity industry has not helped themselves by some of the sales practices that they've engaged in historically in many cases. But I think some behavioral finance elements that also contribute to this, and is the current moment bias, which is that we as human beings have a hard time envisioning ourselves in the future. I mean, I have a hard time envisioning myself now, feeling like I'm still 15 years younger than I am today, and I have an almost impossible time imagining what I'll be like at the age of 65. And I don't think I'm alone or unique in that. At least behavioral finance would indicate that I'm not. Okay, we would like to experience pleasure today because we can't really anticipate what's going to happen in the future and the risks of incurring that pleasure. This contributes, by the way, to deferral rates, right? Which is I'd much rather have a boat today than participate in my retirement plan and therefore be able to retire 30 years from now. That happens all the time. But this happens on the annuity side, because when you buy an annuity, what ends up happening is you take the $600,000 that you saved over a working career and you give it to an insurance company for the protection that you can live till 120 and still get a paycheck over that period of time. Current moment bias is it's very, very painful to save $600,000 to give it to an insurance company. No, you may not live to 120. You may not live to 70, and as a result, your $600,000 will be gone forever. Second is really this illusion of control that we have as participants. We overestimate our ability to control events. So that we have a number of participants when surveyed who say, well, performance as an investor will outpace that of the insurance company. There's not much data to support that individual investors can even match the performance of the market, which is really what insurance companies do as a method to protect themselves against longevity risk for all of their population. So the notion that I, as an investor, are going to do, again, better than the marketplace, whether it's the overconfidence effect or the illusion of control that we have as an investor, the data doesn't support that. But those two elements have significant impact on causing participants to opt away from or choose not to utilize lifetime income solutions, whether they're within your plan or even outside your plan in an individual retirement annuity sense. And I'm talking about for full account balances. For the majority of participants, the utilization of accumulated balance would more likely be only a partial element of their defined contribution balance, just to protect themselves against the true minimum living costs that they may incur. But even for those populations, partial annuitization of accumulated benefits is atypical well less than 1 in 5 of participants opt for some form of annuitized benefit in retirement. So about that on the lifetime income side, there clearly is going to be additional regulations that come out related to this. The Department of Trade, Department of Labor, and the Internal Revenue Service are baffled by why more participants in a defined contribution plan don't elect to annuitize a portion of their account balance. I think that as a result, you'll see increasing incentives for plan sponsors to incorporate solutions into their retirement planning models. But there's some suggestions that ultimately, whether it's in the plan or to the providers themselves, that will have a significant impact on whether participants choose to annuitize. Certainly one of those is accept that participants want to have control. So by providing participants more flexibility and control on the annuity side does seem to have a significant uptick in participants' willingness to consider annuitization. There's products that have been licensed recently that are bonus annuities where if the markets do well, you get an increase in your payments. One of the ones that I think is particularly appealing and really speaks to the current enrollment bias is limited penalty-free withdrawals. So rather than saying, once I make my $600,000, I only am going to get my annuity check every month, the ability to take some additional money today so I can use it to buy a boat, knowing that will have a detrimental impact on my future income, but the flexibility to do that without penalty is attractive to investors. And certainly partial annuitization is the one that is increasingly being utilized in education plans. How much protection do you need, given your account balance structure, to ensure you have a higher likelihood of your retirement income goals? It gets back to framing, too. Annuities, by and large, aren't investment vehicles, and as a result, talking about their investment attributes, I think, really hurts their position in the marketplace. Ultimately, annuities provide that inflation protection and longevity protection, and educating participants on why that's important. The last really is that people tend to misunderstand annuities. So on the annuity side, it's true that ultimately the success of the payments has in large part to do with the solvency of the insurer who's guaranteeing the annuity, but the reality is that most states also have some additional protections to incorporate those that choose to buy into annuity products. But the negative bias and probability bias ultimately hurt plan sponsors. So addressing some of those regulatory issues and helping participants feel a higher sense of confidence ultimately will alleviate some of that negativity bias and address the probability bias. The likelihood of your insurance company going under is much lower than the likelihood of you outliving your defined contribution balance if you live to 110. That's a probability. And explaining that probability to participants so they can better understand it helps alleviate concerns that they may have about annuitization. So about inverting the retirement plan, one of the areas that we talk about inverting the retirement plan most distinctly is on the education side. Most education plans that we see are focused on educating young investors as to why they should participate in the plan and helping them understand the investment vehicles that are there as a whole. I feel that that's the population that I'm least worried about because of automatic enrollment, auto escalation, QDIAs. Employees are in a better position to achieve retirement income adequacy than any other segment of our population. The reality is that the population that needs education, and really even beyond education, guidance and advice most heavily, and where plans would benefit most concretely, is on the retiree population. I argue those 60 years of age and older, because that is the group that has a tremendously complex decision tree that they're going to have to walk through, and provide, again, framing, education, resources, and personal support to address that becomes critically important. That planning process with that population, it really allows you as the plan sponsor, in partnership with your vendors, to help participants bring to a fine point where they are in their retirement planning projection process. What do they have externally? What's their spousal income? What are their true needs in retirement? How are they going to handle and manage their healthcare resources? Because the reality of not having these conversations with participants is not somehow going to solve the problem, because participants will not leave and retire until they are confident that they've accumulated enough in retirement savings. So the way to get them that level of comfort is to begin to provide that critical education, guidance, advice, support through the process. Participants are looking for answers on how to secure and protect their accumulated savings, and ultimately they're asking the question, so once I quit and I'm going to get a paycheck on the 15th of the month, when am I going to get my paycheck the next day? And helping them concretely plan through that process we think is important. Education to a very targeted group, education that really extends beyond education and gets into guidance, planning, and advice, does have positive impacts on getting participants more comfortable with the retirement planning process. So about any of these things ultimately becomes the question, right? I mean, it's the defined contribution plans and the defined contribution marketplace. What we've done essentially is transition much of the responsibility for retirement readiness from the employer to the employee. Reality is, if we don't address those first three factors, participation in deferral savings rates, investment returns, and transition to lifetime income for participants, there will be impacts on our business. We can see them in a number of different studies. Employers in DC plans retire 1 to 2 years later than in pension plans. Individuals covered by a DB plan are almost twice as likely to retire in any given year as defined contribution plan. I think one of the ones that really lends to this behavioral finance context is the fact that there's a 1%, for every 1% increase in the S&P 500 index, it actually increases the probability of a pre-retiree retiring by 2.5%. By 2020, 20% of our workforce is projected to be 65 or older. And the only growth in the workforce is over the age of 55. That will have an impact on our ability to retain, promote, advance young talent. If those options aren't becoming open further up our food chain, then they will go to other places where that can occur. But into that issue related to younger talent, there's also some concrete economic costs that we as plan sponsors will take on if we don't have retirement plans that help participants effectively transit into retirement. You can look at workers' comp claims, 25% longer, benefit payments are 56% higher for older workers. Disability premiums are 15 times higher for employees over the age of 65. And for those who are worried about ACA currently, healthcare costs for a 65-year-old worker are twice that of even an employee between 45 and 54. So there are other consequences for not effectively managing this retirement process. And there are limited tools, at least practically there are limited tools, how far we can push participants. But if we at least acknowledge some of the challenges that they have, and that we all have, me included, as it relates to how we go through the saving and investment process, it can help push plans in the right direction, especially if we're able to measure the inputs and outputs that go along with that. What's the retirement plan industry as a whole is this real transition, right? We've gotten away from defined benefit pension plans, understandably, because of the risks associated with employer contributions and, frankly, the accounting and actuarial practices that have been foisted upon these plans. But what's happening now is really the convergence of defined benefit and defined contribution plans. Defined benefit side, for those plans that still have plans, what you're seeing is cash balance plans where contributions are guaranteed and returns are guaranteed with some significant limitations. You're seeing now plans and registration with the Internal Revenue Service where the income guarantees made in the future are contingent upon investor returns, where if investor returns are not achieved, then ultimately payments to participants would be reduced over time. And on the defined contribution side, you're actually seeing greater involvement of employer responsibilities. Whether it's QDIA, automatic enrollment, whether it's managed account solutions or other solutions that help drive participants toward a level of retirement income adequacy that will be helpful and healthy for the workforce, you're seeing that transition happen relatively rapidly. And I think we're going to continue to see innovation both on the pension side and on the defined contribution side. As you invert your retirement plan, really focus on the retirement adequacy outcomes. So rather than spending quite as much time on what our contribution rates and what was the performance of our large cap value product, how is our investment structure, our plan structure as a whole, contributing to better retirement outcomes. So let's spend less time focused on investment performance and more time focused on participant performance. I've said routinely in committee meetings that you could have the best fund in every asset class. Ultimately, you could still have a plan that doesn't work because participants don't allocate correctly. They chase markets. They avoid risk. What the issue may be, having great investments does not equate in all instances having a great retirement plan. And again, focus on your least sophisticated participants. Your sophisticated participants will always do well. They carry the skills, the knowledge, and the experience to perform successfully. Our concern is how do we affect those and how do we impact positively those that don't share those characteristics. Those that we always recommend, evaluating your current retirement readiness. So how is your plan generating retirement income and how effectively is it driving participants toward having replacement income that's going to be somewhere between, pick a number, somewhere between 70 and 80%. 75 is usually pretty safe. What obstacles do you have to getting participants into the plan? And what obstacles are, how do we get them out of the way? How quickly can we get, with as little paper, as little in-face time as is needed to get people into the plan? Are mechanisms to move people towards adequate income replacement? Are we providing them estimates of what their income replacement is on benefit statements? Do we have some form of auto increase program that gets them that 15% in aggregate between employee and employer contribution? 4, we have to continue to worry about plugging holes. And holes really comes maybe in 3 fashions. I've mentioned here taking a look at your current loan demographics. I mean, we can really restrict the effectiveness of a retirement plan by allowing people to take money out of it periodically like if it were a checking account, but also restricting the amount of expenses that we have to pay as participants. The extent that we can manage those relationships more effectively, certainly expenses is one of the holes that you would see in a retirement plan. And building a communication plan to support the objective. So in that inverting phenomenon, how do we focus more on the latter portion of the retiree workforce, provide resources and tools. I'm not saying at the expense of our younger workers, but you only have $10,000 to spend on education within your contract with your provider next year. I believe that $10,000 should be heavily weighted to those that have the most money in the plan and ultimately who need the assistance the most to achieve a successful retirement outcome. That's the close of my presentation today. You'll see on the right-hand side the ability to ask questions or through the chat methodology. I take some additional questions that come up over chat, those resolved. If there are questions that you submit and we don't get to, we'll certainly get back to you in those in writing as we wade through them. I'll take the first question now, which is, while annuities are beneficial to employees, what about the additional complexity of the plan sponsor regarding fair disclosures required in the annual audit statement? And it really gets to this notion of the additional guidance and support that we expect to get from the Department of Labor and Internal Revenue Service. I think that will start probably on the safe harbor side, which is to say, hey, if you're going to offer annuities, here's a safe way to do that where you as the plan fiduciary won't be held liable for the performance of the annuity as long as you have some screening process, not dissimilar, frankly, to what defined benefit plans have had when they essentially payout annuities for terminated retirement plans. I do think that the financial accounting side, on the audit side, is more challenging, in so much as those are driven more by the AICPA, and I haven't seen a lot to indicate that the AICPA is that quote-unquote worried about the extra work and complexity that goes into the fair value disclosures. I think that the fair value disclosure work is beneficial to sponsors. I think, frankly, too few sponsors actually process it and really understand the fair value measures that are used in their audit statements. So there are a number of areas where, from my perspective, the AICPA could potentially make easier some of the disclosure requirements that therefore would reduce the cost of annual audits and still be as beneficial to plan sponsors and even the participants in government as access to them. But I think that is one of many issues that is causing plan sponsors to be slow to adopt annuity products within their plan for participants. We will provide these slides probably within the next 3 or 4 days. We'll send those out. So you should get those via email. They'll also be posted at some point to the website, again, probably in the next 3 or 4 days, as well as a recorded version of the presentation. So if there are those within your organization that didn't have a chance to attend today, they'll have an opportunity to hear my dulcet tones if they choose to later on. No additional questions. I appreciate your attendance today. Please look forward to our next webinar, which I believe is scheduled in August. It's our annual regulatory update. It'll be delivered by Gina Gurgiolo, who is our Technical Services Director. Thank you for your continued interest. And should you have questions that occur to you after today's presentation, please feel free to email them to me at eric.daly@multnomagroup.com. Thanks so much. Bye now.